today in America, a woman was killed by her own country's government gun, and then that same government tried to turn her wife into a criminal. This incident began on a quiet street in Minneapolis, where ICE agents were moving around without any local police, without clear identification, and without a warrant. And as soon as Renee Good and her wife Becca Good came outside to warn their neighbors by blowing a whistle so that children could go inside and no illegal action could take place, an ICE agent, Jonathan Ross, pulled out his gun and fired a shot directly at Renee Good's face, killing her on the spot. Under American law, whenever a government official kills a civilian, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division is required to immediately investigate to determine whether the law was broken, whether policy was violated, whether de-escalation was attempted, and whether lethal force was used without justification. But in this case, the DOJ not only refused to investigate the agent, instead, it began trying to open a criminal investigation against the victim's wife, Becca Good, because she exercised her First Amendment rights by protesting and warning people. This sent a message across the entire country that if you raise your voice against government abuse, you yourself can become the target. And witnessing this injustice, outrage erupted inside the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office, where 6 senior career federal prosecutors, including the office's number 2 leader and the heads of the violent crime and major crime sections, resigned because they could not be part of orders that crushed both the Constitution and the law. At the same time, in Washington, D.C., 4 prosecutors from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division also resigned because they were being blocked by the leadership team appointed under Pam Bondi from investigating this deadly ICE shooting. Even though this investigation is the most sacred duty of that division, as videos emerged, it became increasingly clear that the agent violated policy. Federal rules state that officers should not stand in front of a vehicle. Yet he did exactly that. After the first shot was fired, he was already out of danger, but he still fired 2 more shots directly into the car and toward Renee Good. This deepened the question of whether this was self-defense or unlawful use of deadly force. When the DOJ covered this up and even hesitated to share evidence with state investigators, the public began to feel that the Justice Department was becoming a shield for power rather than a protector of citizens. Meanwhile, Becca Good was intimidated in the name of investigation so that others would remain silent and no one would blow the whistle on ICE actions. This is the very strategy in which the law is weaponized to crush dissent. That is why the resigning prosecutors said they could not work in a system that turns the victim into the accused and protects the shooter. Because American democracy does not run only on elections, it runs on the principle that government power is bound by law. But here, that restraint is being loosened, making every citizen who speaks the truth unsafe. As this case spread, state-level prosecutors signaled that they could appoint these former federal prosecutors in their own offices so that an independent and impartial investigation of ICE agent Jonathan Ross could take place. Just as has happened in past cases, this created hope that if justice is being blocked at the federal level, a path will be found at the state level, and this is the confrontation now facing America. On one side, a DOJ that appears to be protecting power, and on the other, lawyers, citizens, and state officials who insist that the law must apply equally to everyone, whether or not they hold a badge. And this is the point where this story becomes not just about a shooting, but a test of the entire justice system. Whether America will stand by its Constitution or bow before the government gun. The way ICE agent Jonathan Ross shot Renee Good is becoming not just a tragedy, but an example that violates every rule written in law books. In America, federal law enforcement officers are clearly instructed not to position themselves in front of a moving or stationary vehicle because it creates unnecessary, deadly confrontations. Yet, according to video and eyewitnesses, Ross placed himself in front of the vehicle, escalating the situation. When the first shot was fired, he was already out of danger. Despite that, he fired 2 more shots directly into the car toward Renee Good. This is the moment where the claim of self-defense collapses, because U.S. law requires that once the threat ends, the use of deadly force must stop. Yet here, force was escalated. That is why, in normal cases, the DOJ Civil Rights Division investigates such shootings to determine whether the officer broke the law, violated policy, or trampled constitutional rights. But this time, the DOJ shut down the entire process. State investigators were denied full access to video and forensic evidence, and the ICE agent's statement was accepted without challenge. This raised the question, is the Justice Department acting as an independent investigative body, or has it become a shield for power? Meanwhile, the sort of investigation was hung over Becca Good to scare anyone who might raise their voice against ICE. History shows that when governments entangle critics in legal trouble, the rest of society falls silent, and the same strategy is being repeated here. On one side, the shooter is protected. On the other, the whistleblowing citizen is criminalized. Even though that whistle is the soul of American democracy. Seeing this double standard, federal prosecutors found it impossible to remain silent because they knew that if this became precedent, every future shooting could be buried without investigation. That is why they resigned, to tell the country what was happening inside. Because within the DOJ, two factions now exist, one that wants to remain accountable to law, and another that has bowed to political orders. As this case reaches the media and courts, it will become clear that this is not just the story of one ICE agent, it is the question of whether any government official in America can be above the law. If it happened to Renee Good today, it could happen to another neighbor tomorrow. That is why state-level prosecutors are now looking for ways to bring this case under their jurisdiction for a fair investigation. Because the Constitution says that when the federal government fails, the states must keep the lamp of justice burning. And that struggle has now begun. One in which courts, citizens, and honest prosecutors will decide whether the law is still alive in America. When news reached Washington, D.C., that 6 federal prosecutors in Minnesota had resigned, shockwaves went through the Justice Department. This was not a routine administrative dispute. It was a clash over the fundamental question of whether the DOJ exists to protect power or to protect citizens' rights, and this is where Pam Bondi's name emerges. Under her leadership, the DOJ's top levels decided there would be no federal investigation into ICE agent Jonathan Ross, while at the same time pushing forward a criminal investigation against Becca Good. This inverted justice shook even the career prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division, because that division exists precisely to investigate lethal force used by government officials. Yet here, prosecutors were directly told not to touch the case. When they argued that video, witnesses, and forensic evidence demanded a serious investigation, they were silenced. As a result, 4 senior prosecutors who had spent decades working on police violence and government abuse cases resigned, because they could not be part of a department that was breaking its own rules. This made it increasingly clear that 2 realities now exist inside the DOJ. One connected to law and the Constitution, and another driven by political orders. And this conflict is now burst into the open. When prosecutors resign, it is not just the loss of jobs, it is a warning to the public that something is deeply wrong inside the system. Pam Bondi's team argued that a federal investigation was unnecessary because the case could be handled at the state level. Yet in the same breath, they avoided handing over evidence to state investigators. This deepened suspicion that the truth was being suppressed. As media questions grew, the DOJ tried to hide behind formal statements, while internal emails and conversations revealed pressure from above to cool down the case. Because if a federal case were opened against an ICE agent, it could set a nationwide precedent. And that is exactly what political leadership fears, a precedent that says a bat and a gun do not place you above the law. So it was considered safer to entangle the case at the state level and shift focus onto the victim's wife to redirect public debate. History has seen this tactic many times. When power diverts attention from its own wrongdoing by casting suspicion on victims. This time, however, honest people inside the DOJ refused to accept it quietly. That is why this wave of resignations spread beyond Minnesota and reached D.C., causing a nationwide question to echo. Is the Justice Department still independent? Or has it become a political tool? As this question strengthened, state attorneys general and local prosecutors began preparing to intervene, because the Constitution says that when the federal government fails, states must protect their citizens, and that is why a new front is opening in this case, one where courts will decide whether the decisions taken under Pam Bondi's leadership were lawful. This battle will ultimately determine whether the soul of the DOJ still survives. As layers of Renee Good's death and the DOJ's decisions peeled away, it became clear that this case is no longer limited to a shooting or a single ICE agent. It has become a test of America's constitutional structure. The U.S. Constitution is built on the principle that each branch of government checks the others, so no power becomes absolute. But when the DOJ refuses to investigate a deadly incident and instead targets the victim's wife, that balance begins to collapse. That is the moment when state governments and prosecutors are forced to step forward. Because if justice shuts down at the federal level, states have a responsibility to protect their citizens. That is why Minnesota's attorney general and local prosecutors began considering whether they could appoint the resigned federal prosecutors to conduct an independent investigation into Jonathan Ross, just as has happened in other high-profile cases when the federal government stepped back. This step is not only legally possible, but aligned with the constitutional spirit that justice must come from somewhere, whether from Washington or from St. Paul. As this option gained traction, pressure mounted on the DOJ because its decisions were now facing not just moral but legal challenges. Blocking the Civil Rights Division from investigating may not be an administrative choice, but a potentially unlawful interference. If courts determine that the decision under Pam Bondi's leadership violated the law, the DOJ would be forced to reopen the investigation and hold accountable those who blocked it. Meanwhile, Becca Good's lawyers signaled they would challenge in federal court the intimidation of a grieving wife for exercising her First Amendment rights. This case could become a landmark for free speech because if the government can criminalize protest, democracy becomes only a name. That is why civil rights organizations, media, and legal experts have taken this story so seriously. They know that if this is accepted in the ICE context today, it can be used by any agency against any citizen tomorrow. As the debate advances, it is becoming clear that a legal tug-of-war has begun between the DOJ and state governments. The question is no longer whether an agent fired a shot, it is whether any government power in America can be above the law. And this confrontation will echo through courts, Congress, and the public in the coming months. Renee Good's death has now transformed from a personal tragedy into a national debate over whether justice is still blind or whether it has been forced to wear political glasses. Renee Good is no longer just a name or an incident. She has become a mirror in which America is looking at itself and asking whether the law still protects citizens or has become a shield for power. When a woman is killed by an ICE agent's bullet and whose wife is placed under criminal investigation, it is not just a failure of justice. It is a warning for democracy. That is why this case has shaken the entire legal community. State attorneys general and local prosecutors are asking whether the federal government is fulfilling its duty. Resignations from within the DOJ are not personal choices. They are alarms sounded for the public that something is deeply broken inside the system. Despite grief and fear, Becca Good is preparing to knock on the doors of the courts to prove that the First Amendment is not only alive in books, but on the ground. This is the fight that will determine America's soul. Because if the government can criminalize protest and mourning, any citizen's voice can be crushed tomorrow. That fear has united civil rights groups, journalists, and legal experts to ensure every action of the ICE agent is investigated and every DOJ obstruction is challenged in court. History shows that whenever power is left unchecked, its strength grows at the cost of the innocent. That is why this case has moved beyond Minnesota's streets and reached courts and Congress nationwide. The question is no longer why a bullet was fired, it is whether the government has begun to see itself above the law. As the struggle continues, every American will have to decide where they stand, with badges and guns, granted immunity, or with a constitution that guarantees equal protection to every citizen. Renee Good's memory now represents not just a mother, a wife, or a neighbor, but the principle that democracy survives only when power is held accountable. That is the legacy America must choose at the end of this story. Fear or law, silence or truth. And that decision will determine the direction of the country in the years to come.